My name is Meha Suri. I'm an extension specialist with the Agricultural Law Education Initiative, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our 6th annual conference. And thanks for joining us in this first ever online format. We heard in our previous session about all of the flexibility and adaptations farmers are making in the face of COVID. And we so appreciate our audience being flexible and to our panelists for joining us online this year. Our session was made possible in part by our sponsors, a full list of which is available on our website. Our talk today is titled A Fresh Look at Clean Air, Maryland Ambient Air Quality Study Roundtable. We will be recording the session and all of our materials will be available online on our website afterward. We are offering nutrient management credit for the session. So if you want credit or you need credit, please go ahead and provide your name and voucher number in the chat box so we can verify your attendance to Maryland Department of Ag. Marta, if you are able. Great, thank you. And so please just go ahead and pop that in the chat. While we do that, I'm so pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists. Today we will hear from Margaret Todd, a research assistant and my wonderful colleague at ALEI. We'll hear from Dr. Suzanne Dorsey, Assistant Secretary of Maryland Department of Environment, Samantha Campbell, the President of the Keith Campbell Foundation for the Environment, and last but certainly not least, Holly Porter, the Executive Director of Delmarva Poultry Industry. We're going to start with a federal air quality overview, a regulation overview from Margaret Todd, then move on to an overview of the Maryland program from Assistant Secretary Dorsey, and then I will have what I hope will be a robust and lively roundtable discussion with time for questions at the end. So please do go ahead and send your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can after the discussion. My colleague, Sarah Everhart, is monitoring the chat, and our panelists will be able to use the chat feature if they wish. So Ms. Todd, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and share your screen and we can get started.
Okay. All right, so I hope you guys can see my screen.
Yes, looks great, and we can hear you great.
Awesome. Okay, great. So let's get started. Like Meha said, I'm going to give a quick, just 5-minute crash course on the Clean Air Act. So this study is about collecting data on the ambient concentrations of ammonia and particulate matters 2.5 and 10 on the Lower Eastern Shore. Like she mentioned, the other panelists are going to go into more detail on the how and the why of this project, and then I'm going to give just a very quick overview of the Clean Air Act so that you can have a better idea of what the existing regulatory framework is for these air pollutants. So first of all, the Clean Air Act was enacted in 1970, and it requires the EPA to regulate any airborne pollutant which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. So the first thing that's really important to understand about the Clean Air Act is that the EPA achieves the Clean Air Act goals by regulating in 2 different ways. The first way is by regulating or by creating national ambient air quality standards, or NAAQS. So it creates NAAQS for what are called the 6 criteria pollutants. These have basically remained unchanged since the law was enacted. There's been a few changes that we don't care about today. So you have lead, ground level ozone, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, which you'll remember is one of the pollutants being monitored in this project. And then you also have nitrogen and sulfur oxides, which contribute to acid rain. So these are the 6 criteria pollutants that the federal government has NAAQS for. They can come from diverse and numerous sources. And so they are regulated on a regional basis. And by regional, I mean state level. And then each state is broken down into county and metro areas to regulate those ambient air standards. The EPA gathers and collects data on ambient air quality across the United States. And so they really do this in partnership with the states to achieve their ambient air quality goals. And then keep it on track through using state implementation program or plans, sorry. And they're supposed to update or review these standards every 5 years. On the review, they may change them or they may just keep them the same. And so that's an overview of the NAAQS. The second way that the EPA regulates is by establishing standards to limit the emissions of hazardous air pollutants from stationary or mobile sources. So hazardous air pollutants are those that are known to cause cancer or other serious health and environmental impacts. So currently there are 187 listed toxic air pollutants. Ammonia is not on the list, in case you're wondering. And I think this second way is probably what most people envision when they think of the Clean Air Act. You know, you have a pipe or a smokestack, like on an industrial facility or the end of a car, and you're able to like absolutely quantify what's coming out of that pipe. So these sources, they have to get permits and they have to emit any of the HAPs, and they have to use prescribed technologies to control and scrub away those pollutants before emitting into the air. So, you know, this is a picture of the Baltimore incinerator, which is infamous. And so you might have a typical commercial facility that the emissions are regulated. In the agricultural context, it might be a grain elevator that has to get a permit, but this is not what we're talking about today. We're not worried about emission standards. This study is really about the ambient air concentrations of these particular air pollutants. So let's talk a little bit more about the NAAQS. When you look at a NAAQS standard, you might see two different numbers. You might see a primary number and a secondary number. The primary number is a level that's set to protect the public health, and the secondary level is a level set to protect public welfare. And that generally means like environmental health. So it's the quality on the soil, water, vegetation, wildlife, things like that. And so once the EPA sets these standards, the primary and second standards, it then will designate individual counties or metro areas within a state as either an attainment, non-attainment, or a maintenance area. So attainment means that the area, the region is doing great, they're meeting those standards. Non-attainment means that the county or area is not meeting those standards because it's exceeding those ambient concentration thresholds. And then we have maintenance, and maintenance means that it's an area that only recently began to meet the standards and must continue to provide EPA with more information to make sure that they stay on track and eventually are recategorized as an attainment area. So when you have non-attainment and maintenance areas, that's when the state implementation program or plans come in. The state has to create a plan, and it's approved by the federal government to bring down those ambient concentrations of those 6 criteria pollutants. And so if you're curious about how, you know, farming operations fall into this, usually the ambient air emissions or results from any farming practices like a prescribed burn, for instance, those are going to be regulated on a local level and not from the federal government. Okay. Oh, geez. Okay, I'm running out of time. So right here is an example of an attainment history for the state of Maryland for particulate matter 2.5. Since I'm running short on time, I'm going to go ahead and skip over this, but you can go onto the EPA website and find this information and see that currently we are in attainment for particulate matter 2.5. So let's talk about what these pollutants that we're monitoring on the Lower Eastern Shore actually are. Particulate matter is very fine very fine particles of pollutants that become suspended in the air, and they can be inhaled into your lungs. The EPA has provided a great graphic for this to compare it to the average strand of human hair. And the diameter of the average human hair is 30 times larger than the finest particulate matter 2.5. These are the NAAQS. And so, sorry. I'm trying to see if I have any. Okay, so the next are for particulate matter on the federal level. We have, you can see 2.5 has the primary and the secondary, and those are averaged over a year. There's one standard for a year average, and then we have a standard for a 24-hour period average. You'll notice that the level, the threshold for the 24-hour period is 35 micrograms per cubic meter, and that's higher because it allows for daily spikes in the levels, whereas on the annual, you want those daily spikes to dissipate out and have a lower average to protect human health. And then finally, we'll get into ammonia just quickly. So it's a colorless gas, and it has a very distinct odor. It's produced naturally in the environment. We breathe it in every day. We also excrete it naturally. The problem with ammonia, though, is that in excess amounts, it's very toxic and harmful to human health. And it's also actually a precursor to particulate matter 2.5, which means that when it reacts with nitrogen and sulfur oxides, it can create particulate matter. So the problem is it's not regulated on the federal level. It's not one of those 6 criterion that have a NAC set for it. And there are certain other environmental laws that would normally regulate ammonia emissions over a 24-hour period, but those are only applicable to commercial operations. They don't apply at all to emissions from animal waste at a farm. And so it's important to notice that even though there aren't federal regulation standards or federal standards for ammonia, ambient concentrations of ammonia, Maryland does have some standards because ammonia is classified as a class 2 toxic air pollutant, which means that there are acceptable ambient levels or AALs required. And so these are used to evaluate the air quality impacts of all the operations, buildings, facilities within a 3.1 mile radius of where those levels are taken. And so you can look here on the bottom and you see the concentration levels here for ambient air or ambient ammonia levels are averaged over 1 and 8 hours, and they're much higher. There's a 450 microgram per cubic meter limit over a 1 hour period, and then it goes down to 300 micrograms per cubic meter over an 8 hour period, and that's on average. So that's just an overview quickly of the standards that exist for ammonia and the particulate matters 2.5 and 10, which are being monitored in the study.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Margaret. And Suzanne, Dr. Dorsey, if you're ready, we're ready for you and your slides.
Great. Let me get started sharing my screen here. All right. Let me know if you can see that.
So we can see the slides, we can hear you, but it looks like your video is off. And if that's on purpose, no worries.
Nope, there we go.
Okay, there you are.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much to everybody at ALEI. Thank you to the audience. It's a privilege to be with you this afternoon to talk a little bit about the Eastern Shore Ambient Air Monitoring Project. This project came out of concerns raised by citizens about the quality of air on the lower Eastern Shore, particularly as it related to the poultry industry. The mission of the Maryland Department of the Environment is to protect and restore the environment for the health and well-being of all Marylanders. And without adequate data to respond to citizens' concerns about the ambient air, we were excited to work with colleagues and find resources to put together scientifically valid monitoring stations for the purpose of providing data for MDE, but more importantly for the public to use and analyze to determine what health concerns may exist. So I want to recognize the Air and Radiation Administration, and particularly the Ambient Air Monitoring Program at MDE. The scientists at the Air Monitoring Program were the ones who worked weekends, late nights, traveled during the pandemic to make sure that this equipment was up and functioning. So let's see, hopefully, there we go. So I want to start with this. This is not the best graphic, but it's a grab from our website. And I'm going to refer to the fact that this data is available right now for anybody to access, download, and analyze independently. This is a map with 4 locations. The experiment had 2 controls and 2 experimental sites. The controls were in Baltimore, an urban site, as well as Horn Point on the Lower Eastern Shore, which was not impacted by poultry industry at all. And then 2 lower shore sites, Princess Anne and Pocomoke City. I'll return to this in just a minute. So the objectives of the air quality monitoring project was to collect ambient air near poultry houses, and we had 2 specific experimental sites. One was a high density and another was a low density site. And this is density as it relates to poultry operations. We also had 2 control sites, as I mentioned previously. The air quality data is available right now on our website, and the site is here. We used EPA siting criteria for the site selections, and the data, we began collecting the data in April, and we continue to collect it today. So this is just a quick, another screen grab of the information that's available on our website today. You can download a data summary, and you can download a PDF with all the data file, with the data as well. So again, 4 sites, 2 sites were configured on the Lower Eastern Shore, high and low density, and then 2 sites that were the control locations. Ammonia was collected, the ambient air was, the ammonia in ambient air was measured using an EPA approved method. And as Megan stated, there is no existing federal health standard for ammonia. So Maryland used our toxic screening level of 350 parts per billion. That is a 1-hour air toxic screening. We felt like that was a fairly conservative number, and it was just a number that we chose so that we could compare the actual data to some health standard. And again, others may choose to use different health standards. This was one that we felt was both conservative and had acceptance in the field. So there is some more background on this for anybody that wants to look into it. As Megan mentioned, we also collected data about particulate matter, both fine at PM 2.5 and the coarse particulate matter. The sampling for this air pollution was conducted using federally approved sampling method, federally approved siting methods, and installed by our professional scientists at MDE. The data here was compared to that NAAQS value that Megan discussed. So this does have a health standard, and we used the same 24-hour NAAQS standard as we collected the data. So you'll see a nice comparison to a health standard there. We also collected wind direction and meteorological conditions at each site. Here we go. Okay, so here are our 2 sites. These are the experimental sites. We have on the left Pocomoke City, which was the higher density site, and on the right Princess Anne on the UMES farm. The Princess Anne was our lower site. So on the left in Pocomoke City, we had 29 broiler houses within a 1-mile radius, 70 houses within a 2-mile radius, and additional poultry houses outside of that 2-mile radiuses. In the Princess Anne site, we had no broiler houses in a 1-mile radius and 7 within a 2-mile radius. And of course, there were some more farther out than that. So those are the 2 experimental sites. Again, the control sites, Baltimore City and Horn Point, so non-agriculture. So let's go over some of our results. In the top part of this graphic, the shaded, I want to carefully go through what the axes are. First of all, the top 2 graphs are from our control sites. The upper left is our Horn Point site. The red line is that NAAQS number. This is for particulate matter 2.5 or fine particulate matter. Remember, this has the health standard, and you'll see the red line is that health standard. So in our rural Horn Point site, none of the data collected between April and September showed any moderate to high PM 2.5 readings. The PM 2.5 in Old Town, which is the Baltimore City site, had slightly higher readings, but none approached that federal health standard, that NAC standard. On the lower two panels, again, the bottom axis is time, April through September, and the height is the 24-hour average particulate matter 2.5 in micrograms per cubic meter. Princess Anne is our lower density site relative to poultry operations. Pocomoke City on the lower right is our higher density site. And again, we did not see any of these data approaching that federal health standard. So this is a data, oops, sorry about that. So this is a table summarizing the data. In the upper right, you'll see that NAC standard. Again, 35 micrograms per cubic meter is that NAC standard. And on in the first column, you have the average 24-hour value. In all of our sites, they were significantly below that 24-hour health standard. Even our median values were below. We did see a slight difference in the maximum 24-hour values, so the highest values that we received at all sites. We see that on average, our experimental sites, our agricultural sites, were slightly above our control sites. Moving to coarse particulate matter. So this is PM10, and we have here only our experimental sites. The reason that we don't include in this graphic our control sites is because we used a slightly different collection methodology for those sites. So we didn't want to compare them exactly to each other. What's important here is that both in our higher density poultry operations site, Pocomoke City, and our lower density poultry operations, none of the readings approached that federal health standard, the NAC standard. Here's a table with a summary of the same data, the PM10, the coarse particulate matter. You'll see again our control sites, Old Town and Horn Point, as well as our Princess Anne Low Poultry and Pocomoke City. Not significant differences between any of these. And when you compare it to our NAC's health standard of 150 micrograms per cubic meter, none of these data, either the average, the medium, the maximum, and certainly the minimum, approached that NAC's standard. There was a slightly higher rating, again, in our agricultural sites relative to our rural, our urban sites, but not significantly different. And that's so far. We're still collecting data. Now we get to the ammonia, and this graphic has all the data sites collected together. We have time from April to September on the x-axis. The y-axis is not daily averages, as you saw previously, but this is average, hourly average ammonia in parts per billion. The red line is that MDE, air toxic screening level that we discussed earlier. And you'll see that the control sites are the green and the red lines. And you'll see those are the lowest data on this chart. The agricultural sites are blue and orange. Pocomoke City is our blue signal. That's our high density site. Princess Anne is our lower density site. And you'll see that a lot of the peaks above about 100 parts per billion were concentrated primarily from late June, early July through mid-August for this site. So quickly summarizing the data, again, our 1 hour screening level is 350 parts per billion. And our, our control sites were lower. In particular, if you look at the maximum hourly value, you'll see our control sites were lower than our agricultural sites. We did in the maximum level have higher peaks than we saw in our control sites. If you come over to the average, you'll see that on average, however, there wasn't a significant difference from our control sites. So that's it with the data, and I look forward to a robust discussion.
Great, thanks. Thank you. So if I could have our panelists all turn on their video if they are comfortable, Samantha and Holly. Great. Okay, and if you could go ahead and unmute as well.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Holly.
Hi, how are you?
Great. So thanks again for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Dorsey and Megan, for that regulatory overview. And now let's get into it. So the first question I have, I'm going to direct this to Samantha. So what was the Campbell Foundation's motivation for getting involved with this study?
I thought you might ask that. Hi, everyone. Just to remind you who I am, I'm the president of the Keith Campbell Foundation for the Environment. Keith Campbell is my dad. He lives in Baltimore, where I grew up, and we've been funding work in the Delmarva and Maryland since 1998. And I'm just going to show two things. I'm sure everybody knows where the Delmarva is, and that's important. Let's get back up there. There it is, the Delmarva Peninsula. This is the area where our foundation focuses most of our resources. And I wanted to also show one other quick picture of why. This is a picture of an area near the Wye River. St. Michael's is in the distance. This is a place I stayed with my family a couple of summers ago for about 2 months. And this sums it up for me. The beautiful bay and the stick that my son found laying there on the picnic table, and the promise of like the crab feast there on the table. This is why our foundation does what we do. And so that'll probably come up a little bit later. But as to why we got involved in this project, we're always looking to solve problems on the health of the bay. And one of the problems that we've been trying to figure out how to work on is nutrient pollution. And that involves us a lot with agricultural stakeholders. And for a while, we took the tack of more of a stick approach that focused a lot on regulation. And I must say that that got really frustrating for me, because I felt like we were actually growing more and more apart in our conversations with stakeholders, and the regulations, the regulatory part wasn't solving the problems fast enough for the bay. So what I wanted to do was have more conversations and opportunity with the agricultural industry. And so when this project came across my desk, I was excited, not so much about what the results would show, but that we could start having more conversation with the state of Maryland and with DPI and the chicken industry, and just try to understand more about the common priorities that we could work together to solve. And honestly, the Campbell Foundation hasn't funded a lot of work on air and air quality. We focused a lot on the water, but of course those two are interrelated, and we might get to that later. But this is actually the first kind of big air project that we've funded. And our role was to provide funding for the actual equipment, if in case that's interesting to the participants.
Thanks so much. And so, Holly, I'll pose the same question to you. What were the motivations for DPI to get involved in this project?
Sure, thank you. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk a little bit about this project that has been a passion, I think, a project over the past couple of years. A lot of conversations, a lot of meetings to make it happen. And I'm just thrilled to have this partnership with both MDE and with the Campbell Foundation. But you know, really part of this got started from to the point of what similar to what Samantha mentioned, in the sense of this was partially started for us because of the regulatory side, because of some bills that had been introduced in Maryland, specifically claiming that the air within communities around chicken houses was not healthy. And so, of course, our membership are chicken farmers, are people that live on these chicken farms. So of course, their air that they're breathing is the same as those in the community. So we did, as DPI's organization, did oppose those bills. But more importantly, I think what we realized is we didn't have a lot of data. We didn't have science. We didn't have some data to say, what are those numbers, you know? So that's really why we got started, was to say, you know, it's really hard to have conversations about those bills when we don't have any monitoring stations on the lower shore or within areas around chicken farms. So that was really how we got started. From there, again, we reached out, really started probably with the Maryland Department of the Environment and reaching out to them to see what the possibilities were, how we could go about doing something to try to gather data. We felt it was really, really important to be transparent. We wanted to work with experts. We are the experts in raising chickens and harvesting chickens. We are not the experts when it comes to ambient air monitoring by any means. And so that was part of the reason with working with MDE for that help. And then really, I think somewhere along the way, we started to have the conversations with the Campbell Foundation. And again, very similar mindset in wanting to do things that were going to make a difference. That was going to give us data, that was going to help in not only ways to possibly, you know, help with water quality, but also to, again, make sure that our farmers, our employees, everyone that lives in the community, because those same community members are also members of DPI as well too. We want to make sure that their air that they're breathing is the best that it can be as well too. So, and that was sort of the reason why we got involved with it and are pleased where we are so far.
Thanks so much. And Suzanne, I'll pose the same question to you. I know you touched on it a bit in your talk, but if you could just talk more about what MDE's motivation was in getting involved with this project.
Right. I think it really is, you know, our regulatory authority and our need to respond to citizens' concerns. And we are a science-based organization. Science is at the core of our decision making. So the opportunity to collect data that we can use to help respond to concerns from citizens was the primary reason why we wanted to move forward with this opportunity.
Thanks. So something that I was just taking some notes as the three of you were speaking, and all three of you noted that there were some common values between the three organizations, despite being kind of having different goals, you know, fundamentally environment, poultry, regulation. I heard some common values. Some things I heard were transparency, being evidence-based, being data-driven. From all three of you, I heard about environmental protection, health protection, focus on the people and the clean air and the clean water. And so I wanted to, I'll start again with Samantha. What were some of the core values that you wanted to bring into the project, and I guess some goals in that sense?
Well, we've been funding the Bay watershed work since 1998, and we plan to fund it pretty far into the future. And so one of the core values that I have for our foundation is long game, is patience, persistence, flexibility. Those are the things that we try to embody in all of our work, because the environment doesn't turn on a dime. Changes all of us have experienced changes in weather that we've noticed that have become more noticeably extreme, but they've been building for a while. And I think everybody understands that if you're going to try to work on a project frankly, human health components in the environment, it's going to take a little while and might take some wrong turns. And I would say, the Campbell Foundation, one of the things that I really want to explain is the connection between environment and vibrant communities. We don't want to have a healthy bay if nobody's around to enjoy it. So the economy and the industries that rely on a healthy bay are really important in the Campbell Foundation values. Also, the communities that exist and have historically existed, like the chicken industry, with community members who are non-chicken industry folks, that lifestyle can continue. Those communities can continue. And I think a lot of the community members I've talked to have expressed a willingness and an acceptance that this is part of the fabric of the Delmarva. And so it's really about balance and looking forward together. And those are some of my core values.
Thanks. Holly, I'll ask the same question about core values and goals for DPI.
Sure. So I think that, you hit upon several of them that are really important. So agriculture in general is very science-based. Farmers out there are willing to adapt to new technologies, are willing to adapt to things as long as they're science-based and they make sense. It's very much a show me, prove it to me. And when you do, then farmers will make those changes. And so I think it's really important to have that key of being science-based. So make sure that we have data that we can say, because, we've been very, very honest when we went into this. We didn't have data. We had no idea, and we still don't. We're still only 6 months or so in knowing what the data was going to look like. So, but we wanted to get those numbers. We want it to be science-based. And number two, again, I think that transparency piece is so important in making sure that this information is available for our members, for citizens that live within the communities, and that it's available for everyone to see. And that was really important because we do want to be transparent. We're a chicken community that's very proud of what we do and how we raise birds and, what we do for the economy. To Samantha's point, I mean, it's a $1 billion economy within the chicken community in Maryland, Delaware, and Eastern Shore, Virginia. And so we're very proud of that. And we want to be transparent about that as well, too.
Thanks. Suzanne, I'll pose that question to you.
Yeah, I think you've hit upon, core values at MDE include, of course, following the law, both federal and our state law. Science is a core value. We are a agency that is made up of a lot of engineers and scientists, and specifically David Krask and his team in the Air and Radiation Administration take great pride and ownership in their ability to both set up and run and maintain quality scientific infrastructure, and therefore record really good, excellent quality data. Transparency, of course. And the one I would add that I think Samantha touched on it, but we feel very, very keenly at MDE today is environmental justice, and the idea that where we have regulatory authority, that the part of our mission that says all Marylanders, that we take that to heart and that we view our role through the lens of environmental justice very carefully. And that's something that has really risen to the top as a core value for MDE.
Thank you. So next, I wanted to move on to some of the strengths and weaknesses of the project so far. So Samantha, I will go ahead and start with you. So some strengths and weaknesses of the project so far from your perspective.
I feel lucky to be called on first. I get to say my piece first. I hope y'all don't mind. Raise your hand if you want to cut in on me, Holly and Suzanne. So thanks. You know, I think everybody on the panel has their own take on strengths and weaknesses of the project. So I will speak just for the Campbell Foundation. One of my regrets was not going directly to community members early on to hear from them about their priorities and their and how we could include their voices in the design of the project. It seems obvious now, and I'm trying to rectify that in other works that we're doing at the Campbell Foundation, but I do think that was a weakness on my part. And also, Holly referred to the legislative side, and I think that we've explained through a number of public fora that we aren't trying to prove anything with this project. It's not nearly adequate enough in terms of size of data samples to prove anything. And so the idea that it could conflict with any kind of legislative proposals just doesn't make sense to me. I feel like the, Suzanne, you might want to mute. We can hear your blinds.
I'm sorry.
That criticism that somehow this project was designed as a kind of a alternative to any kind of legislation and solving problems that legislation was seeking to solve is just not true. And I think that conflagration was sort of clouded the issue of what this project was trying to achieve, which is really on the ground data and starting a conversation amongst stakeholders. Campbell Foundation and DPI did not work together in the recent past. That was very far-fetched and kind of a ridiculous idea. And when Holly came on the scene and I started to run more of the East Coast program, you know, we came together and started to form a relationship because we wanted to make progress on some issues. That's sort of the nexus of the project. But I think that one of the weaknesses that was imposed on it because of timing, you know, yes, it had something to do with the question of like, well, if there's no data, why don't we gather some? And that had to do directly with some legislation that was being introduced. But the fact that this project would have anything to bear on the progress of that legislation just really, I think, hindered our discourse amongst a lot of stakeholders.
Thanks. So Holly, your thoughts?
I think that part of, and I don't know if this was strengths, weaknesses, or also sort of lessons learned, I think, or maybe challenges is the better term. You know, I think it was a lot more difficult than we thought it would be to find the right locations, the siting piece of it. And, you know, for, you know, good reasons. Mainly because, again, you know, in my mind, and this is why we worked with MDE, because they are the experts in sort of the siting and what ambient siting looks like, what needs to be around it, what's not around it, but also making sure that we were looking at what we would like to say is a representation of the industry on Delmarva. So, you know, we had several people that were looking at different areas, and it was, we didn't want what some might say is worst case scenario, but we also didn't want a, you know, sugar-coated, like the Princess Anne site was never meant to be the more concentrated area, because there really aren't as many chicken houses in that area. So I think the siting piece, I think worked out really, really well. It was slightly off from what we were originally thinking about, with the design being sort of upwind and downwind. I think that, you know, again, this is where I'm really pleased with MDE, and Suzanne mentioned David Krask and his team, who have been absolutely amazing, but, you know, their ability to say, okay, plan A wasn't working, let's think about plan B, and sort of setting it up the way it was worked out really well. But, you know, I think that ends up being a strength because, again, when you take a look at those circles and look at the number of houses that are in that area within that Pocomoke City area, I mean, that's very typical and representative of really probably the whole Delmarva, depending on if you took a pin and just stuck it in the middle of Delmarva and put circles around that. So I think it ends up being a strength, but it was definitely a challenge early on with the siting as well too.
So Suzanne, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm the perpetual optimist. I want to compliment colleagues. There was a lot of concern that either an environmental group and or industry group would influence the science, and that has not been true at all. Again, I think there's mutual respect. I think you've heard some of it today. Our scientists at MDE were adamant that their experience on the ground, their air quality expertise was going to lead how we move forward with this project. And that's 100% what has occurred, that our scientists have chosen the equipment, did the siting, and made the key scientific decisions. That was all based on objective science and the ability to collect high quality data that would be meaningful to the questions that we felt citizens of Maryland were asking.
Great, thanks so much. So I have one last question for our panelists before we open it up to audience questions. So again, to our audience, feel free to send those in the chat and we'll get to those. But my last question for our panelists is probably a burning question for all of us. What are some next steps? And, none of us have a crystal ball, but what do we maybe hope to expect in the future, plan for the future, and what are some of our next steps? So everyone's kind of smiling because I know that's an impossible question.
But we were just talking about citing, and I think, that's forefront in my mind because, as the conservation minded, I'm sure all of us are conservation minded, but as sort of the flag that I fly, I want to see if we can have more stations. And since I know that I could provide resources to purchase physical stations, we need somewhere to put them. And so that would be sort of my wish list. I think that I've always wanted to stand behind the assertion, like I was saying before, that this is not a one and done kind of okay, we got what we need from these 4 stations, done. We need more. And so I hope that the study can, or the project and the data gathering can continue, at least with the stations we have, but I would love to. So if you know anybody who wants to site a data station on their land, and hopefully it's near poultry operations, please give us a ring.
So Holly or Suzanne, next steps or wish list steps for the project?
Yeah, so I think, and you're right, I'm not sure it was one of those things where I felt like we were running 100 miles an hour to get things up and running. And so now it's like, whew, okay, let me take a breath, and what's next? We've talked about it even internally within DPI or environmental committee as to, trying to dive a little bit deeper into the data. Taking a look again, Suzanne shared some information there. And, again, none of the numbers are anywhere near any levels that we're seeing anyway, any of the thresholds or numbers. But at the same time, there are a couple, pieces here and there that tend to spike up. And it would be really interesting to sort of dive into that and try to better understand what some of those are and what those mean. If we can, and I don't know if we, will be able to, but, as well as to try to take a look at gathering information about, and I see someone in the chat has talked about, emissions. Again, our project was ambient versus emissions, but it would be interesting to take a look a little bit more at some of the emissions studies that have been done in the past and sort of look at some of those different baselines as well too. So not totally sure at this point in time, but really we're just looking forward to getting the next sort of 6 months worth of data as well too, and then go from there.
Hey, before Suzanne jumps in, Holly, there's another question in the chat about coronavirus and bird populations, and I think that's relevant to your answer because of timing of the project. We got started a little bit late, and then coronavirus hit. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I saw that, and Yeah, we took a look at that, and of course, coronavirus, as you know, we're all living in 2020 right now, darn 2020. But we're going to take a look. I mean, there was obviously a decrease of placements across the board, across the Delmarva, of chickens, primarily in the months around end of April, beginning of May. Where those were across Delmarva, we can't say specifically at this point in time, but it is a part of the discussion that we've had in maybe continuing the study. So it was always meant to be a 12-month, 1-year study from whenever the date was that it got started. But because of coronavirus, that might be, we have had discussions amongst the partnership of potentially extending it 2 or 3 months. So it does try to capture what I'd like to say would be a normal year. Again, I'm not sure what's normal. I would say for the chicken industry in particular, we were, especially out on the farms, were probably hardest hit early on. I don't believe that the numbers are significantly different at this moment in time than where they were this time last year. There's always sort of ebb and flows, but for the most part, within the chicken industry anyway, our marketplaces are starting to come back for the most part. So I don't think that there will be significant differences when it comes to the bird populations, but that is something that we have discussed and looked at again, and potentially extending it out at least a couple more months, because those early months were the time frame that we were the most impacted here in Delmarva.
Thanks. So Suzanne, anything to add?
Yeah, a couple things. First, in terms of next steps, this data is out there. I am very excited to see any academicians take up the data and use it, and do some research on it and publish some results. I think that would be an amazing outcome. And then the second thing is, it's full circle, going back to what Samantha started with, and that is, we're very interested to hear from the community. And what do the citizens of the Lower Eastern Shore think? What are their concerns? This is ambient versus emissions. There's a question about emissions. There are a lot of agricultural research projects about emissions on poultry operations and as well as others. But we were really focused in on the ambient air quality. So, if there was an interest in emission-based work, I think we can call on existing data to answer those questions. But, again, I think what's most important is, where are the citizens and how are their concerns? How do they feel? And, finally, I do want to point out that this is just a timestamp in 2020, a very special year. That doesn't mean that we couldn't get different results as we move forward. This is an ongoing objective reporting of the ambient air quality on the Lower Eastern Shore.
Thanks. So my colleague Sarah has been monitoring the chat. I know we're a bit over, but we have a lot of great questions. So for those who can stay on a few more minutes, we'd love for you to stay on. Sarah, did you want to read out the first one?
I think if I could interrupt, Suzanne, that they were just a question came in about public outreach, and I think you're best suited to answer that.
Okay.
So the public outreach that we've done so far is just the transmitting of the data through our webpage, and that is the transparency that we've done as far as this. As the data was coming in, it was important that we did not do a lot of analysis. You did see some summarizing, some very basic averaging, high, low, that type of information. I think in many ways it would serve the public if an independent academic entity were to take on this data and provide another perspective and a credible and objective information. But the Maryland Department of the Environment is always willing to meet with citizens and talk about the data that we have and explain anything and give any additional information.
I would add in here too about the public outreach, of course. So seminars like this, presentations like this, where we can share just the website, You know, we did when we did get up and running, I think it was around the June timeframe, DPI and the Campbell Foundation did a joint press release out to let folks know, hey, we're up, we're running. Take a look at the information. You can find it at this website. And, you know, we've also shared that within our own publications within DPI as well, too. And so we're just really trying to spread the word, if nothing else, to share where folks can go to find that data. We've also shared that with legislators and encouraged them to share that with their constituents as well, too. And so we've tried to share as much as possible, I think, and again, working on different with organizations and different groups like this, and any time that we can talk about or share the website, we've been doing that as well too.
Thanks.
And as we build the next
I love-
steps, I think whatever the next steps might be, the involvement in community voices, that we're gonna do things that we didn't do before. So look for that to come.
So it looks like Megan answered the question from Andrew Gray about the draft model for emissions. So let's move on to the question from Kenneth. Is the data considered to have any value in getting better estimates of ammonia deposition rates or the eventual fate of ammonia lost from poultry? So I think that's probably maybe a Suzanne question.
Sure. Hey, Ken, how you doing? So yeah, I think there was a study that was funded by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and scientists out of NC State used sort of the worst case scenario to populate a model to describe deposition in the Chesapeake Bay. Now, this data now can tune those models about air deposition using real-time data. And I think that would be a really interesting outcome. These models are available and commonly used in academia to estimate, based on the amount of nitrogen coming from ammonia, as how much of it reaches the bay and deposits into the bay and adds to the pollution load in the Chesapeake Bay. So I think this data will be helpful in tuning the existing models to be more realistic and based on, you know, hard science.
Thanks. So the next question from Nathan. I have a question about the level that the study chose to measure ammonia and the particulate matter. Curious about the process that MDE went through to determine the parts per billion that was the standard. Sounds like, you know, I understand it's related to clean air and NAAQS, but I was wondering if you could talk more about that process.
So Nathan, I invite you to reach out to me so that I can put you in touch with our scientists. What was really important to our team was that we use analyses that are widely acceptable, both in academia, but also as it relates to the Clean Air Act and our federal partners, so that this data would be useful along a broad spectrum. So the tools that they used, the collection equipment that they used, as well as the reporting standards are based on our experience monitoring air quality throughout the state of Maryland, and as well as our experience with the technical tools that we had available to us. If we had unlimited resources, would we have had more options? Certainly, but we feel that these were very adequate to the task and are acceptable in the environments that I discussed, academia as well as government.
Great. And so just the last question here, I really love this question from John Torres. And if I could get comments from all the panelists on this. So he says, chicken farmers on the Delmarva are also citizens of Maryland. And with all of our discussion about community voices, I think this is a really important question. So chicken farmers on the Delmarva are also citizens of Maryland. How are we addressing the concerns of farmers in this air quality project?
Yeah, I have the shortest answer, so I'm going to go first. When I talk about community members, I mean all of the members of the community. Sometimes we think of the phrase community members as a certain segment of people who have a certain voice and message. But at the Campbell Foundation, we're really thinking of the people in the community, and that includes farmers. So that's my quick comment. That's how I feel.
Thank you.
And I guess I would say too, and this is, sort of the point that I made earlier too, as well, is that when there really wasn't any data available, it's the same thing. We weren't looking at it just from, those who may have been putting in bills, who may be, sort of critical to the industry. We're also looking at the farmers that live and breathe this air as well too, including myself. I'm one of those. I live right here in the Eastern Shore. I'm no more than not even a half a mile from a chicken farm from my house where my kids play outside. So, again, I think that no matter who the citizen is, it's important to have that data and have that information. And, just as important to our chicken farmers, the employees of companies, the allied businesses that all live and breathe the air here on Delmarva as it is to everyone. So, I think it's important that this data is for anybody and everybody. And again, that's sort of, a big part of that transparency, that anyone can see it. And that, in my mind, we're really helping, we're helping to gather data and information that's important to anybody that lives and breathes on the Eastern Shore of Maryland.
And one other thought, I know that there's a lot of, I talked about the kind of the animosity between stakeholders, environmental activists and industry folks. I think there's a lot of animosity, it seems, in communities, farmer versus non-farmer. And that's another thing that at the foundation, that I'm asking questions about, how we can go into communities and construct positive dialogue and move these issues forward, instead of members of the same community, meaning where they live, not seeing eye to eye and really butting heads every day. It must be a really stressful place to be when you don't really want to hang around with your neighbors. And so that's just another part of where this project is leading, in thinking about, okay, well, what do non-farmers think about farmers in the same community, and how can we help heal some of that?
Thanks. Suzanne, last words from you?
At MDU, we regulate a lot of different industries, clean air, clean water, clean land. And, at the core, we have to define the problem. And what is the problem? We can't solve a problem unless we can define the problem. So this was a first step towards helping define a problem and determining what role MDU or government should play in addressing that problem. So I think we still have a lot to do in terms of defining what our problem is, and what are some solutions that the citizens want to consider, both from an industry standpoint, from an environmental advocacy standpoint, but also from a government regulatory standpoint. So we are ready to embark on that journey and to listen to all the voices, including farmers.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We are well over our allotted time, but I certainly learned a lot, so I appreciate you staying on. If you need nutrient management credit, please go ahead and re-enter your name and nutrient management number in the chat box so we can verify your full attendance. And if Marta's still available, to go ahead and just start collecting that. So thank you so much to our panelists for your time. I learned so much. I feel quite inspired about the future of ag production and environmental health and clean air for Maryland. So I'm going to join you on that eternal optimist train, Suzanne. I hope our attendees feel the same way. So as was mentioned before, we are going to send a conference evaluation via email. This is our first time doing it online, and we appreciate any feedback on how we did today. So please do be sure to join us next week for sessions 3 and 4. We'll be focused on environmental litigation, including the Conewango Dam and EPA enforcement related to bay cleanup. On behalf of all of us at the Agua Education Initiative, thank you very much for attending. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.